I'd like to welcome everybody to today's partner webinar, Accommodations Data, Where It Comes From and What to Look At, presented by Key Data's Head of Destination Sales, Chris Christmas. Chris brings years of experience in the short-term rental space, working with companies and focusing on various aspects of the industry. His journey started in real estate, building vacation rental homes in Jackson, Wyoming, before moving to a SaaS company that focused on municipal compliance and tax collection for STR operators. That transition opened up the complex and sometimes contentious conversations surrounding the industry and spurred his interest in the market as the market continued to boom. After helping guide that short-term rental sales team through an acquisition, he joined some industry friends at Key Data to head up tourism sales across the US and Europe, focusing on past, current, and future metrics in the vacation rental industry. A little blurb about TTRA. For those of you who are not TTRA members, I hope that you will join us. You can learn more at TTRA.com. TTRA unites university academics, professional researchers, and research experts, the best and brightest from the travel and tourism research community. We are using Zoom webinar platform, so please drop your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session or during the session. And now I'd like to turn it over to Chris Christmas.
Thank you very much for the intro. I will definitely throw a secondary plug for TTRA. If you're not a member, should be a member, one of my favorite organizations to be a part of, just in terms of the people that are involved in the events and conferences that they put on. So awesome to be, presenting or co-presenting here with TTRA, talking about the wonderful, wonderful world of accommodations data. So just as a quick overview, as she said, my name is Chris Christmas. I'm the head of destination sales over here at Key Data. If you're not familiar with Key Data, what we do is accommodations data. So historically, we've worked in the vacation rental space a lot with property managers, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But we've also started working with hotel data to give you kind of a whole comprehensive picture of what the markets look like individually, as well as what they look like, side by side. And I've gotten a ton of questions at conferences this year as these discussions kind of shift and change about where is this data coming from, right? Like it seems to be all over. It's coming from different places. Where is this data coming from? What's the reliable source of data? What does this data actually mean? How do we take it and know that it's reliable and make decisions from it? So my main goal, coming out of here is to hopefully shed some light on some of those questions, as well as to hopefully leave you with some questions of your own. Is to say, okay, now I kind of get a holistic picture of where things are coming from, what people are looking at. What about X, Y, and Z? So usually I try and take questions during these things. I'm happy to field some questions and just keep the conversation lightly as I move through the presentation. If you think of things afterwards, I know that this will be shared as well, both the video and I believe the slides. I also have some trend data that we'll send out as well. So if that kind of spurs some questions, feel free to reach out to me, and hopefully this makes you think a little bit outside of the box of what you've thought about accommodations data beforehand. But I'll share my screen here and try and start this thing, if you bear with me. And this is, as much as I love to do a good old classic sales pitch, this is not going to be a sales pitch by any means, or really even looking at the Key Data dashboard or the system. It's more geared toward provider agnostic, or even people who don't have data. It's just to show you again what's out there in the world of data, what's possible, and the ways that people are using it. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things. Some of this is going to be relatively basic. We'll start, kind of with the one-on-one stuff. We'll work into, a few more complex topics. And again, hopefully you see something that you haven't seen before, or start thinking about the data in a different way than you have traditionally. So we'll kind of just dive into it here. The agenda is going to be starting out, where does it come from? There's a lot of different places it comes from. There's a lot of different uses, and a lot of those uses depend on where it comes from. So we're going to look at probably the three biggest sources of accommodations data. Is going to be the direct source, the scraped source, as well as survey data. We're going to see what are some advantages of those, what are some disadvantages of those, and the all-important question, right, is which one to use and when. That's probably the most impactful. Is we have all this data. Which one should I be looking at to make the best decision? So that's kind of the next topic that we'll go into. We have this data now. What do we look at? We'll look at the top KPIs, right? I'm sure most of you are familiar with the top KPIs that we're going to be looking at, but some of the other important metrics that maybe people traditionally haven't looked as deep into that are starting to gain popularity, whether it's post-COVID, whether vacation rentals have taken a bigger chunk of the accommodations pie in your area, whether hotels are losing market share or gaining market share, ways that we can use that data to kind of make interpretations about what's going on both in the vacation rental and the hotel data space. And then looking at probably my favorite part of the entire conversation is going to be the metadata. So the metadata is the data about the data, right? So where is it coming from and how are we getting that data? Really cool ways that we can look at not only the numbers, but kind of the information beyond the numbers that can give you incredible insights that you might not have been leveraging as much as you could have. And then kind of the next step. So, my recommendations, and I've talked about this a few times throughout the year at some conferences, my recommendations for some of the biggest shifts that we can make in the industry and how we're looking at data. I think forward-looking data is becoming more and more relevant as we're making these decisions, not only looking historically, but looking at the next week, the next month, the next 4 months. Doing internal benchmarking is becoming more and more feasible as well. So this is a very common thing that we do with states, where they divide up not only into counties and their big cities, but they want to see regions. So they'll custom define a region. Counties do this a lot. They might have their cities, they might have within city limits, they might have the county that's without, outside of city limits that they want to look at. But I think what's traditionally been less common is cities using this. So the ability for a city to say, okay, I want to benchmark a particular neighborhood or something like that. And we'll dive into this. But then the classic, what about everyone else, right? So looking at your competitive sets, not only your neighbors, maybe a different state, maybe a different country. There's a lot of different destinations out there that are doing things differently. And it's really valuable to, take stock of how am I doing against some of these other destinations. So we'll probably not get into trends. I got a lot to talk about and probably not as much time as I'd like, but for the trends, we just put out a great trend report again for the US. We also did one for Europe. I'll definitely include that in the follow-up if you want to look at some of the trends across the US. There's been a lot of news articles, in the past couple of weeks, especially about Airbnbs and things like that. So if you just want to kind of get a pulse on, what's going on in the US, maybe in your region, as well as overseas, some great trends I probably won't talk about today, but we'll also include in the follow-up. So we'll start with the basics. Where does all the data come from? There's a few different, there's a multitude of sources. I'll talk with the three that I think are probably the most common in the industry and that people have some level of familiarity with, starting with direct source data. This data comes right from the reservation system on a particular cadence. So if we're talking about, a Marriott or a Hilton, they have large reservation systems that all of the reservations come through. Doesn't matter if it's from booking.com, someone walks in the door, whatever that might be, those come from different sources, but they're all ran through a central reservation system where that information is captured. And so for the property managers, it works in a very similar fashion. There's going to be a lot more property management systems. I think there's definitely over 100, depending on where you are in the country, where you are in the world. There's just a lot more property management systems, but the same function, right, is where you're integrating directly into that reservation system and getting the data right from there. The second method is probably the second most, or probably the most popular, is the scrape data. So this is where we're pulling information from public sites where listings and rate shopping is available. So think of the Airbnbs, the Verbos, Expedias, Booking.com, Priceline, where anyone can go on. You can find listings for hotels, you can find them for vacation rentals, you can rate shop for certain dates. You can see when calendars are available and things like that, especially if you're looking at a individual property. And so pulling that information from those public sites is what we would call the scrape data sets. And then the third one I'll talk about is survey data or self-reporting data. This is where it is collected from the operators themselves, not through some kind of integration. So whether it's a monthly or weekly delivery where they're basically sending you an email or dropping a file. This is common with a lot of DMOs. They do it on their own. There's some third parties that do it as well, but I'm just kind of collecting it directly from the operators themselves. So we'll start with direct source data. We're going to look at some advantages and some disadvantages, and then we'll kind of compare and contrast that with some of the other sources. So advantages of the direct source data: the depth and the accuracy. So because it's coming right from a hotel system or a property management system, the depth of the data, we're going to have those people's names, where they're coming from, when they booked, how long they're staying, how they booked that reservation. So the depth of data that we get is going to be a lot more comprehensive. The accuracy of the data is going to be very high. So minus like human error, like if I accidentally booked for Christmas of 2024 instead of 2023, outside of the small margin of error for human error, the accuracy of the data is about as good as it gets, right? It's coming directly from that system without any human interaction in between. So there's no self-reporting in that data. It's just an integration into that system where you can see exactly what's going on with those hotels or with those property management systems. The frequency of the collection is also an advantage because you're integrated directly into that kind of lifeline between the hotel and the reservations. You get a very high frequency of collection. You can do this more than daily if you wanted to, if you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty, but having that daily delivered data can be a huge advantage, especially during peak seasons and stuff like that. And you got to love the metadata. You'll hear me say it a million times. It's probably one of my favorite things to talk about. So all of the different data you can get around feeder markets, where are those visitors coming from? The segmentation: is this group travel? Is this business travel? Is this, government employees? Is it a hotel employee? As well as source. Are they booking directly with the property manager? Did they book it on Airbnb? Did they book it on Vrbo? Did it come from the GDS? So a lot of different metadata that you can pull from those systems just because you do have that lifeline. Some of the disadvantages: it's harder to acquire. So this requires privacy agreements. There's integration costs. There's just the hurdle and the barrier to entry to getting access to that data, as you can imagine, is very high. It's the reason why Airbnb doesn't share any of their data. All of their data is private and stuff like that. And so there's just a lot of moving parts as you start talking about getting access to data of a private corporation. Another disadvantage, because of that fact, it's going to be aggregated and anonymized. So versus the traditional scrape data, where I can go to an Airbnb listing and click on that listing, I can analyze the behavior of that particular property and that particular listing. the direct data has to be aggregated and anonymized. So you lose a level of visibility, especially when you get down to a granular level about how an individual hotel is performing, or a particular property, if it's a vacation rental. So you do lose kind of a degree of insight there. And then the sample size. This is probably the biggest disadvantage. If I've talked with you about key data, I'm sure you've heard me talk about our direct source data, the advantages and also the disadvantage. And this is probably the biggest one. It can lead you to misleading conclusions depending on the use case. So the first and most obvious is going to be there's a small or non-existent sample, right? So this is very common in rural communities where we don't have a lot of chain hotels. They might be, individual hotels. There's not a lot of property managers. And so it's a lot of RBO, what we call a rental by owner. And so we just don't have the integration and the visibility into the market. It might be just a too small of a sample, or we might not have data on it at all, depending on where it is. Even if we do have data, you can still get very biased results from that data, right? The two biggest that I think of are geographical bias and type. So when I'm talking about geographical bias, we'll look at a state, for example. We'll use my home state of Wisconsin. So if we're integrating into the big hotel chains and the big property managers, where are those going to be located? They're going to be in the core leisure markets and the urban markets. So you're thinking like Door County, right along Lake Michigan, where people like to spend the summers. Thinking, downtown Milwaukee, which has a huge influx of visitors consistently throughout the year. Madison, Wisconsin Dells, kind of some of the big areas where people want to go. But that's where our data is going to be primarily focused. And so we're going to lose a lot of insight. If you look at that as a whole, we're going to have a lot of geographical bias for those areas. And we're going to lose a lot of insight into the rest of the state, where there's still value in looking at that data, right? And so you need to be able to parse out where there might be geographical bias. Is it enough that we can segment it and look at them differently? Or should we look at a different data set to kind of mitigate some of that bias? And then just the type of unit that's being rented to. So this is common between property managers and the rental by owners. So if you think of where the property managers are, core leisure markets, right? Ski towns, beach towns, things like that, where there's just a ton of rentals, and the property managers tend to A, have a big presence, and B, outperform the rental by owners. They have big marketing budgets. Typically, their units are always available. You might have an owner that comes in for a couple weeks or something like that, but that's primarily if it's a property managed property, it's primarily an investment property. That versus a rental by owner, where someone might rent their house for 3 months during the summer or on the weekends, or if they're gone for a long week or something like that, where it's not primarily used like that. So the ADRs are going to be different. The occupancies are going to be very different. And it's the same with the hotels. So if we just think about, the mid-tier Marriotts and Hiltons, those are going to function very different versus your Econo Lodges, your Motel 6s and things like that. And so if you don't have the visibility into those budget hotels and those RBOs, you're almost ignoring a segment of the market that's really important depending on the market. And so it's definitely important to acknowledge kind of the bias that can be created from direct source data. On the other hand, we have scrape data. So this kind of fills in a lot of the holes, depending on where you are, again, of the direct source data. The advantage, it's easy to acquire public data. You can go on to Priceline right now or Airbnb and look it up for a specific property. You can look at the map. It's not going to give you the address, but you can find an exact property. You can see when it's available. You can see what they're charging. So it's all public data. It's easy to get that information. And because of that, the ubiquity of the coverage is awesome. It's covering basically all of the units that are out there. So it's providing data on the entirety of the set instead of the sample. So this is where, especially in like rural markets and things like that, or looking at the rental by owners, or looking at the Motel 6s or the independent hotel chains, having that scraped data set can really fill in a lot of the blanks that the data set or that the direct source data is missing. This can be huge in some areas and minuscule in some areas. Again, it just kind of depends on what your market looks like and what the geographical split is and what kind of the unit split is. And then the frequency of the collection. So similar to direct source data, depending on how often you want to go out there and collect the data, it's there to collect. You can do this multiple times a day. As soon as an owner changes the rate, it's updated online, you're able to see that and you're able to update those rates. So high frequency of collection, depending on kind of your bandwidth, to be able to see changes in that data. Some of the disadvantages can definitely be less accurate because there's a lot of noise on the OTAs. So inherent in collecting all of that data is there's a lot of data that's just not doesn't look as nice. We'll say that. So you get, fake listings. You get people who have a listing that's 100% available. They never take bookings, or it's 100% booked because they never take bookings. So those are crude examples and extreme examples, but using all of that data together and then trying to build a picture of, okay, what is actually occupancy? What do we count as booked days versus revenue generating days? How do we derive occupancy from that? It requires a lot of interpretation of the data after the collection. So, we call this cleaning the data, but it's basically just going through and making your best guess as to what is true and what's not true. And because you don't have access to like the back end of the Airbnb booking engine or something like that, or any other kind of direct source, a lot of it is just estimates. It's just inherent in the process. So deduplication is another process that creates a lot of trouble. The two I can think of that are probably the biggest. You're going to look at Airbnb and Vrbo, right? Typically, if they're on one, that means that they're on the other. And it's how do we look at that information and say, okay, we know this is the same unit, or maybe we think it's the same unit, and making sure that we're not double counting. And I'll talk about this when we look at aggregate KPIs in just a second. But just a lot more. It requires a lot more work on the back end after you get it than the direct source data, which you can kind of take as a more reliable source when you're looking at it. And it also lacks a lot of the additional metadata. So you can definitely pull some information. You can get some like visitor origin information from reviews and things like that, but it lacks a lot of the context that you can get from a direct integration, especially when you start talking about hotels, market segmentation, booking source, all the feeder markets, not just reviews and things like that. So they just lack a lot more of the additional metadata, which can be, depending on your use case, very valuable. And then the last one is the survey data. Advantages: it's easier to acquire than direct. Doesn't require any kind of costs or integrations or anything like that. You can get good, accurate data. You can get good depth of data too. So depending on who your partners are that are providing it to you, they might be very reliable, providing you with more than you might be able to get off of scraped data, and they might do it on a very consistent basis. So you can get a lot of good value from the survey data, pending that the people who are providing the survey data are actually consistently and reliably doing the survey. So that's kind of the disadvantage, is that it does rely on third-party participation. As we all know, human error can be a big factor sometimes. And so if you have 100 people who are agreeing to send you their hotel data, and 1 month 90 of them do it, the next month 60 of them do it, like you having to rely on that third-party participation can skew the numbers, and can also cause implications of, okay, now I might have to go back and change data if someone reports a little bit late. And so just kind of that human element, I would say, is a disadvantage when it comes to the survey data, but can definitely be very useful if you have the right people providing surveys to you. or self-reported data. We could call it kind of in the same realm. So what should we use? And I'll give you my best, although it's kind of an annoying answer. It's kind of a non-answer, to be honest with you. It depends. If your community has 100% coverage from direct source data, you don't need anything else. If we're directly reporting from all of your hotels and all of your vacation rentals, that is 100% of the data. You don't need anything else because there's no interpretation that's needed, anything like that. But the reality is it almost never happens. I can think of one community in the US where we have 100% of the vacation rentals reporting to us. It's just it's so rare, right? Because you get the RBOs, the big hotel chains cover a lot, but there's always an independent hotel. So it's really rare that you get a sample that's that strong. Between vacation rentals and hotels, that direct source will inevitably have holes. It's where those holes are and how big they are that determines if we should use alternative sources as a complement, or if that other source, if the scrape data sources is the better way to go. Maybe if the direct source is just not a good sample, it says it's not even worth it to look at the KPIs. So scrape data may be the best choice in a lot of situations for those KPIs, but you can still pull the metadata. This is what I think is valuable. You can still pull that metadata from the alternative sources, whether it's survey or direct, to provide context to the KPIs that you might otherwise miss. So say you have a 10% sample of direct source data, that's not enough to look at your ADRs and your occupancy and length of stay, but you might still get valuable visitor origin data from that metadata that you wouldn't have otherwise. And you can also utilize that direct source data or the survey data as an answer sheet on how to treat the scrape data. So you can say, hey, we know this is how these units are performing. Let's provide context to the other units in the market for our scrape data to be able to kind of train that data and provide us more accuracy based on what we do know is kind of the source of truth. And it can also shed light on aggregate questions. I'll talk about this in a little bit as well. It's one of the more common questions I get, especially when it comes to supply as we're looking at short-term rentals. So ultimately a combination of data based on your community is the best to achieve your specific goals. Again, I know that's a non-answer, but as we start looking at DMOs and CVBs, like they all are individual. And so what we have available, the best options for how you want to use it, you really have to kind of take into account, the audience that you're providing this data for to kind of extract the most value. So now that we have it, what do we look at? And this is going to be kind of a 101. We'll start with some of the basics. We'll get into some of the more fun stuff, but kind of the common ones. What I think are the big four, they traditionally have been, and I think they continue to be, especially if you're looking at this on a daily or weekly basis, if you're sharing with stakeholders, council members, whatever that might be, it seems like these are the numbers that they want to see, right? ADR, occupancy, the subsequent combination of those two, which would be RevPAR and the revenue. So not only looking at these numbers individually, but comparing them with last year, as well as comparing between markets, right? Looking between hotel and vacation rentals. Are vacation rentals dominating in the summer when people are spending, 6-7 days here, versus kind of those business travelers who are coming into off seasons and supporting the hotels for 2, 3, 4 nights during the week. There's a lot of different ways that we can really dive into this, but I think these are probably the main four that people like to look at. And I'll just gloss through these because I imagine that most people know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about those four. But I think an important distinction is going to come between occupancy when we look at vacation rentals and hotels for a couple of different reasons. So we have a very basic occupancy chart, right? So this is not taking into account any kind of owner stay, any kind of maintenance hold. This is just a pure investment property or room. And we're saying Of the nights that were available, how many were rented, right? So we get a very easy 60% paid occupancy rate versus a 40% vacancy rate. Very classic way to kind of define it. The nuance comes and more in the short-term rental space than in the hotel space. Hotels obviously do maintenance holds and stuff for rooms as well. But in the vacation rental space, it gets a lot more complicated. Property managers are going to treat it more like an investment property. So you're going to get fewer owner nights, probably fewer maintenance holds as well, depending on what kind of renovations they might have to do after the busy season, whatever that might be. But when you're looking at a rental by owner, this mix of owner nights and open nights can get very complex. And so that's where it becomes really hard to measure what we call the adjusted occupancy. So it's saying, okay, we might have the same 40 were not booked, the same 40 nights were not booked, but why were they not booked? Because 10 of those nights, the owner was there. Maybe 10 of the nights, his sister came into town or her brother came into town and stayed. And so, they didn't make those nights available. And then 20 actually were available and just didn't get booked. So you can start to calculate occupancy a little bit differently depending on how you want to adjust for that occupancy. There's definitely ways to do this with scrape data. It's much easier to do with the direct source data, but it just kind of depends on how you want to view that occupancy versus kind of the traditional way to look at occupancy. ADR, pretty self-explanatory, right? Average unit revenue paid by guests for guest nights in a given time. So this is just averaging out of the nights that were booked. What are people paying? So very, very classic way to look at kind of rates. Are rates increasing? Are they decreasing? We've seen a lot of fluctuations, especially over the last few years, a huge jump, definitely the past couple of years, big jumps in ADRs that are still kind of staying strong. But RevPAR is the more current way to look at it that accounts for both occupancy and rate adjustments. So this looks at them together. This is referred to as revenue per available room with hotels. For vacation rentals, it would be per available rental. With vacation rentals, you can also get down to per available bedroom and per available sleep if you wanted to get way into the weeds. But this is a great way for measuring revenue performance by taking into account the average rate you booked the property and the number of nights it was booked. So it's just a better indicator of overall performance when looking at the ADR occupancy alone. So you might have dropping occupancy, but because rates were substantially higher, you're actually generating more revenue across the market as well as per available rental. So it's a great way to kind of check, the relationship between the two. And is your area going up? Or are you dropping down? And then you can use that metric to dive into the weeds a little bit more. Revenue, we'll talk about this in a minute. Depends on a multitude of factors, but probably the self-explanatory one, total amount of revenue that the units are bringing in. So why do these KPIs matter? I'm sure you all have much better answers than this small list, but I just wanted to list a couple of few kind of common answers that I get from people of what these core KPIs are used for. So they're just letting you know how full your destination will be on a certain date. Helps you understand how your destination's popularity is changing over time. How much are people paying for hotels? How much are they paying for those vacation rentals? What range of visitors are coming? Are they luxury visitors? Are they budget visitors? Are they groups? Are rates and occupancy balancing? Are rates through the roof and occupancy suffering to drive RevPAR, or is that RevPAR suffering because those rates are too high? Is the average room or rental making more or less money? What are the tax implications of this? I would imagine most people are getting some kind of occupancy tax. Definitely through hotels is the more prevalent one. Short-term rentals is also very common. I can think of a number of states that on average collect some kind of hotel occupancy tax, transient occupancy tax. There's a million different names for it, but some kind of tax from those units. So what does our tax revenue look like? And you might even get your budget from some of that money. So what are the implications that might trickle down to me, based on what's happening in the market? And then just pure economic impact. Looking at, are there a lot of visitors coming in? What kind of impact is that going to have on neighborhoods, on trash, and all of these other things, on just local businesses, restaurants and things like that. So it's a good way to look at kind of neighborhood and economic impact as you try and understand the effect on your community. So what about those pesky aggregate numbers? There's multiple KPIs that I would say rely on an aggregate number instead of averages. Main ones we'll talk about are supply, probably the most annoying, I would say, in my opinion, to try and get a handle on. Demand, revenue, or said supply twice. It's that pesky, but demand and revenue for sure are ones that you don't average out, right? So occupancy, you average out. ADR, you average out, but those like true demand, true supply, true revenue numbers are not being averaged out. They're just pure aggregates. If supply is fixed, so I'll use this in kind of the hotel sense, or remains relatively consistent, then accurate comparisons can still be drawn looking at month over month, year over year, et cetera, from a sample set. What I mean by that is, so like if you're looking at your hotels in your community, they're not building any hotels, you're not going to add any rooms for the next 2 years, 3 years, whatever that might be. If that's the case and supply is fixed, you can still draw accurate month over month and year over year percentage changes from that sample set because supply is fixed. And so that still allows you to say, okay, is demand actually up? Is revenue actually up? Are we lagging versus last year? Because that supply isn't changing. It's not adding another kind of wrench into the mix. If the supply is changing, or more importantly, if it's changing rapidly, then there's too many moving parts that make historical comparisons challenging with those samples when you're looking at aggregate KPIs. And so this is where the totals are going to be actually very important, specifically when we look at short-term rental revenue and those supply numbers too, which is becoming more important. So what's supply and when is it important? Supply is the total number of hotels, also hotel rooms, depending on how granular you want to get, and rentals that are available in a given market. Hotels have much more predictable growth pattern, typically much slower. If someone's building a hotel in your area, you probably know maybe 18 months, maybe 24 months in advance how many rooms that's going to add to your market. So a much more linear growth versus vacation rentals can come into the market right now. Right now, I can take a picture of my house and list it in your community. So they can come into the market extremely quickly and with massive changes in supply. So, I think about extreme examples like the Super Bowl or Formula One. I'm sure everyone's read at least one Taylor Swift article at this point in time about the effect that it has on a community. And the easiest way to increase accommodations is through vacation rentals, right? A lot of those people are looking at those ADRs and they're saying, I'll move out for a week and I'll rent my house for $1,000 a night happily. And so you can get these massive shifts in supply. You also get a much more consistent increase in supply as we looked coming out of COVID. A lot more people are renting their homes because it is a second source of income, and it was an easy source of income as compared to a lot of hotels that struggled from shutdowns and things like that. So it's just a much more important number when we're looking at vacation rentals to get a handle on supply. It's an extremely important tool in those instances to be able to see that shift in the aggregate numbers rather than being averaged out. So like looking at revenue from a Taylor Swift weekend versus occupancy for a Taylor Swift weekend, where it's just, all of those are averaged out, are very different things. And you want to be able to see that true aggregate number. So how do we best gauge supply? And I could probably talk about this for a couple hours at least. The job I had before this was in short-term rental compliance. All we did was tie listings to specific parcels of land. So when you go on Airbnb, we would tie that specific listing to a parcel of land in a GIS system, give them owner information. It's a very difficult process to do. It's a long process. I think it's interesting at least, but this is when using scrape data can provide the best insight into overall supply at a given time, as well as looking changes over time. The key to that, because it is public data, that's where deduplication is going to be the biggest margin of error. It's very hard to do well. You can do it with a good level of confidence. I'd say anything over 75% confident up to probably 90% confident you can do relatively easily. It's getting above that 90% confidence level that gets really challenging. And so that's kind of the hinge piece of this scrape data is going to give us the best look at those aggregate KPIs, that supply, but we want to make sure that we're doing that deduplication process, which is matching listings across platforms to a single property, so that we're not having multiple revenues recorded, multiple properties recorded, and doing that accurately. So that can also impact things like neighborhood impacts, concentration of units, visitor experience, and stuff like that. Some of those auxiliary things that are sometimes lost in the numbers, but are definitely important in communities. We'll look at some other important KPIs. When we talk about direct source data for hotels and property managers, I want to say there's 40 of them, or just under 40. There's so many. It's so crazy. And, unless you're in revenue management for a hotel or a property manager, probably not going to be looking at those, or I hope for your sake, you're not looking at those, because a lot of those are just, very not applicable, kind of to the DMO space and things like that. But when I thought about some of the other important KPIs, what really came to mind in conversations I've had this year have been booking window, length of stay, stay value, and cancellations. And so I'll kind of, again, I wish I could spend a lot more time talking about these, but I'll kind of gloss over them, but at least talk about why. If you haven't been looking at some of these KPIs before, are definitely worth at least getting a look at, even if it's on a monthly basis, and, asking industry advisors, your other friends, hey, what are you seeing in these arenas? Is this consistent with, your area? Like, how do you look at these things? It's important to look at these KPIs. Booking window provides crucial insight into booking pacing. So as we look at forward-looking data here coming up, it's going to give us really crucial insight into what's coming up and how are we dealing against last year. And it also helps to direct marketing dollars at the right time. Marketing budget is very valuable. It's also kind of a black hole sometimes on who you're targeting, when you should be targeting them. So using that booking window to inform, your marketing dollar spend can be really valuable. Looking at the length of stay, this is a conversation I've had a ton. How long are people staying? Does it vary seasonally? And probably more importantly now, what kind of visitor is it coming? Is it the weekend warrior? Is it the digital nomad that's staying a month at a time? Who are these visitors? How have lengths of stay changed as kind of the traveler profile has shifted? Same with average stay value. Like, when are the highest spend customers coming? Are they coming on the weekends? Maybe they're coming during the week for a particular concert. How do we leverage that in the off seasons so that we're bringing high spend customers to kind of balance out some of the revenue dips that we might be seeing? And then cancellations. Another really common question I get is whether it's, there's been flooding recently, there's been fires recently, hurricanes, there's so many things that can happen. And obviously they're not all crummy things that happen, but there's a lot of different things that happen that can cause cancellations, not only in the immediate sense, but I've had people ask me, hey, this just recently happened. Can you look over the next few months and see if we're seeing a dip in visitors because of this event that just happened? So being able to leverage that and say, where might we be suffering because of this impact looking in the future can be really valuable. And now we get to talk about the metadata. And I'll tell you, I was planning for right around an hour. If you can't hang out for more than an hour, this will be sent out. I'll try and move through it relatively quickly and get done right on time here. But just giving a fair warning, if you need to jump, these slides will all be available as well as the recording that finishes it out. But talking about the metadata, my favorite thing to talk about, I'm only going to talk about a few of them here. I'll talk about visitor origin markets, visitor source or booking source, and segmentation. You can get way into these, and you can slice and dice these and combine them and do a bunch of different things. We'll just kind of briefly look at what's available and how you might be able to kind of leverage some of those things. So this is the most popular question I get: where are my visitors coming from? And we can look at a number of different factors from the data, but providing insights into where visitors are coming from. You can get down to the country, you can get down to the state, you can even get down to the postal code if you want to. You can get super granular with this information, which again ties into a lot of marketing spend. It can provide context on those visitors, like average spend, length of stay, booking window. So if those visitors from Dallas are spending the most, they're booking 90 days out, and they're staying the longest, maybe you want to target those Dallas folks 3 months in advance with a specific ad and really try and drive a specific type of visitor at the right time. And it also allows you to have metrics to measure ROI on campaigns, right? Where is revenue coming? This is just kind of a heat map for a county down in Florida. I want to say it's Osceola off the top of my head. And it shows where revenue is coming from throughout the country. So this is more of just a fun visual, but the data behind it is what's the real kind of meat and potatoes to be able to take that information and do some pretty cool stuff with. Then market segmentation and booking source. These could definitely have their own 30-minute segment, but this is becoming a lot more important as it becomes more ubiquitous. Market segmentation, providing visibility into the segment of the visitor staying. So is it a group rate? Is it a corporate rate? Is it a wholesale? Is it a government employee or a hotel employee? Seeing what kind of segment your visitor is staying in a particular unit. And then also the booking source. How did that person make that booking? Was it direct? Was it direct with that property manager? Was it through an OTA like Expedia or Priceline or Airbnb? Or did it come through the GDS or the global distribution system? So that's kind of the conduit between travel agents and hotels. I get that a lot from people is, hey, like, should we be targeting and engaging, these travel agents more, as we try and get visitors in, or is that marketing dollar spent better, targeting traditional OTAs and things like that? So to have kind of the distinction between those sources and really dive into the metadata, the back end of it, and get better insights is becoming a lot more popular as more of this data kind of becomes available. So super cool things that you can do with the metadata as well. And I'll talk about probably what I think are my favorite things using this data for. So leveraging the barrage of data, right? So I listed 3 things here. It could probably be 50 things, but it's again, in my conversations I've had to start this year. And as I look towards the second half of this year, it's crazy to think about, but as I start looking at numbers for 2024, even 2025, what are some key ways to really leverage all this data? And the three things that I think could definitely bring that I hear often, but I don't hear as much as what does my occupancy look like, are looking at forward-looking data to provide pacing. Historical data is fantastic. You have to have historical data to provide context, but not only looking historically, but starting to looking in the future, being more proactive versus reactive, I think is a critical step that people can take, as well as that internal benchmarking. So I talked about that earlier, as well as the competitive analysis. So using the really cool forward-looking data, right? Using historical data is invaluable. You have to have this historical data, but adding in forward-looking data can give you great insights into pacing and real-time forecasting. So this is a forecast as of this morning. I ran this forecast for this particular community, and it's looking not only historically kind of to start off the summer of what is occupancy looking like, but how is the rest of the year looking like as of today and as of the same day last year. So blue is as of today for this year. This orange red is as of the same day last year. How was the next, we'll call it 6 months, 5 months looking? And then the top line is like, how did it historically end up? How did occupancy historically land for those time periods? So you can get really incredible pacing information and real-time forecasting, right? Obviously, the farther we go out, this data becomes less reliable because people typically aren't booking 5, 6, 7, 8 months in advance, but gives you really great real-time forecasting, especially if you're planning for an event in a week or an event next month, whatever that might be. Just using that forward-looking data, whether it's occupancy or rates, and trying to stay ahead of the curve and answering those questions before they even are asked of you. And then doing that also with internal benchmarking. So I talked about this earlier. Mapping custom areas within a state or a county are super common, but it's becoming more and more valuable for even cities who are segmenting different neighborhoods, different districts, areas of attraction. I get that a lot. Can you map around the airport or a football stadium? Are you guys able to show us kind of, the difference between the rates and stuff like that? And so it can give you really critical data into areas of interest, hotspots, and the impact of events to stakeholders in the community over specified time period. So this is, if you're not familiar with 30A, it's in the panhandle of Florida. You got Destin just up here. You got Panama City Beach right down here. So very popular area. And 30A is segmented into, I could probably segment it even more than this, to be honest with you, but a great way to look at a singular community and break it up into different pieces and get a really good granular analysis. So internal benchmarking is something I get asked about more and more and more as people want to see that granularity, between hotels, between vacation rentals and things like that. And just the common competitive analysis. So we all like looking at how well our data is doing. What about our neighbors? What about the competitive destination in another state? What about wine country up in Washington versus Texas versus California? So being able to benchmark against different competitors for specific time periods, I think are becoming more targeted as we start to learn more about those other destinations. We want to see, how are we doing against them? Is our campaign, garnering the support that we thought it would? Are we getting a good ROI? Or even using their metadata to target their customers. So, maybe your neighbor has two wine towns, we'll say, in California. Maybe your neighbor is driving a bunch more occupancy during the year, and you want to say, what are they doing right? And you want to look at their visitor origin data to say, where are their customers coming from? What are they spending? Kind of diving into those competitive analyses more to be competitive, not only regionally, but across the state, and really get the most out of your marketing dollars. So that was I'll take a breath there. That was a ton, right? And the goal wasn't to answer some questions, but it was also to kind of get you thinking about some questions. I love having conversations about this kind of stuff. And so I wanted people to kind of see some things that maybe they hadn't seen before or thought about before and come up with some questions. My only sales pitch of the day is we have access to all the data we looked at today for your market. So vacation rentals as well as hotels. So if you have questions, definitely feel free to reach out and let me know. But hopefully I, kind of answered some questions you might have had, and brought up some things that you hadn't thought about before. So that's my long-winded spiel. I think I just made it under an hour. I'm happy to answer any questions. It doesn't look like anybody had any in the chat, but again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to dive in a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Chris. We appreciated it. And if you'll send me over your presentation when we send out the information about this webinar, we'll make sure we attach that.
That sounds great. I'll also include kind of the Q3 trends that we're seeing throughout the state as well as Europe as a supplement, just in case you're curious to check those out.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.